You never think the thing you're most proud of will be the thing that gets you fired. For me, it was honesty. Not the sugar-coated kind, not the let's circle back kind, but the kind that makes people uncomfortable because it's real. My name is Jenna Clarke, and if you told me a year ago that telling the truth would cost me my job, I would have laughed. But that's exactly what happened. It started with a meeting. Isn't that always how these stories go? I'd been at the company for 5 years, working my way up from junior analyst to project manager. I was known for being direct, for calling out problems before they became disasters, and for never letting a bad idea slide just because it came from someone with a bigger title. Some people respected that. Others, not so much. The company was in trouble. Sales were down, morale was lower, and the leadership team was desperate for a win. They called an all-hands meeting, packed everyone into the conference room, and rolled out a new vision for the next quarter. It was all buzzwords and empty promises, the kind of plan that looks good on a slide but falls apart in the real world. I sat there, listening, feeling the frustration build. When they opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand. I didn't plan to make a scene, I just wanted answers. How is this plan different from the last one? I asked. What's actually going to change this time? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The room went silent. My manager, Greg, shot me a look that could have melted steel. The CEO gave a tight smile. Thank you for your feedback, Jenna. We appreciate your candor. I knew then that I'd crossed a line. But I also knew I was right. The plan was a mess, and everyone in that room knew it. I just happened to be the only one willing to say it out loud. The fallout was swift. Over the next week, I was left out of meetings, my projects were reassigned, and my inbox went quiet. Greg stopped making eye contact. Colleagues who used to grab coffee with me now avoided me in the hallway. I tried to keep my head down to do my job, but the writing was on the wall. The official meeting came on a Friday afternoon. Greg and an HR rep sat across from me, their faces carefully blank. Jenna, we've decided to go in a different direction. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately. I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but I knew it was pointless. I gathered my things, walked out of the building, and sat in my car, staring at the dashboard. Fired. For being too honest. I called my sister, who listened as I vented, her voice full of sympathy and outrage. You did the right thing, Jenna. They just couldn't handle it. I wanted to believe her, but as the weekend stretched out in front of me, I felt lost. I'd built my career on integrity, on speaking up when it mattered. Now it felt like a liability. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had a choice. I could let them define me, or I could define myself. I could let this be the end of my story, or I could make it the beginning of something better. By Sunday night, I had a plan. I wasn't going to beg for my job back. I wasn't going to send angry emails or post cryptic messages on LinkedIn. I was going to do what I did best, tell the truth. But this time, I'd do it on my terms. I started by reaching out to former colleagues, people who'd left the company in the past year, people I trusted. I asked them about their experiences, about what really went wrong, and about the things no one wanted to say out loud. The stories poured in: bad management, ignored warnings, and talented people pushed out for speaking up. It wasn't just me. It was a pattern. I realized then that the company's biggest problem wasn't sales or strategy. It was culture. A culture that punished honesty, rewarded silence, and drove away anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. I decided to write about it. Not a rant, not a hit piece, but an honest account of what I'd seen and what I'd learned. I spent the next week crafting an article, part memoir, part manifesto, about the cost of honesty in the modern workplace. I shared stories, anonymized of course, offered solutions, and challenged leaders to do better. When I published the article on LinkedIn, I expected a few likes, maybe a comment or two. Instead, it exploded. Hundreds of people reached out, some to share their own stories, others to offer support, and a few to ask if I'd be interested in consulting. My inbox was filled with messages from people who'd been fired for the same reason, people who were still fighting to be heard, and people who wanted to change the system. For the first time since I'd been fired, I felt hope. I realized that my honesty wasn't a weakness. It was my superpower, and I was just getting started. The response to my article was overwhelming. I spent hours reading messages from strangers, some pouring out their own stories of being punished for honesty, others simply thanking me for saying what they'd always been too afraid to say. I realized I'd tapped into something bigger than my own experience. This wasn't just about one company or one bad manager. It was about a culture that valued comfort over truth and how many talented people were lost because of it. By midweek, my story had been shared across industry groups, picked up by a few business blogs, and even quoted in a podcast about workplace culture. I started getting invitations to speak, first at a local networking event, then at a virtual panel for women in business. Each time, I told the truth, that honesty isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. That companies that silence their truth tellers are building their own downfall, one ignored warning at a time. But the real turning point came when I got a message from a recruiter at a fast-growing tech startup. She'd read my article and wanted to talk. "We are looking for someone who isn't afraid to challenge us," she wrote. "Someone who can help us build a culture where honesty is a strength, not a liability." I was skeptical at first. I'd heard plenty of companies talk about transparency and open communication, only to find out it was just another buzzword. But the more I learned about the startup, the more intrigued I became. Their leadership team was young, diverse, and genuinely interested in building something different. They wanted me to come in as a consultant, to audit their culture, and to help them avoid the mistakes I'd seen firsthand. I accepted the offer, telling myself it was just a short-term gig. But from the first day, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: possibility. The team welcomed me, listened to my ideas, and asked hard questions. They didn't flinch when I pointed out problems. Instead, they wanted to fix them. I started by interviewing employees at every level, from interns to executives. I asked about their experiences, their frustrations, and their hopes for the company. I looked for patterns, for places where communication broke down or where people felt unheard. I shared my findings with the leadership team, and to my surprise, they didn't get defensive. They wanted to know more. We worked together to build new systems: regular feedback sessions, anonymous suggestion boxes, and open Q&A meetings with leadership. I helped them craft a set of values that actually meant something, not just words on a wall. And I watched as the culture began to shift. People spoke up more, challenged each other, and celebrated wins as a team. Meanwhile, my article continued to circulate. I started getting requests from other companies, some big, some small, asking if I could help them do the same. I realized I'd stumbled into a new career, one I'd never planned for, but was uniquely qualified to do. I became a consultant, specializing in honest communication and culture change. But I never forgot where I started. Every time I helped a company build a better culture, I thought about Greg and the leadership team that had fired me. I wondered if they'd seen my article, if they realized what they'd lost. Part of me hoped they had, but a bigger part of me was just grateful for the push. If they hadn't fired me, I might never have found my true calling. One afternoon, I got a message from a former colleague. She just quit, tired of the same old games, and wanted advice. We met for coffee, and as I listened to her story, I realized how far I'd come. I told her what I'd learned, that honesty is risky, but so is silence. that sometimes the only way to change a broken system is to step outside of it, and that being true to yourself is always worth it, even if it costs you everything. By the end of the month, I had 3 new clients, a growing reputation, and a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. I was still honest, sometimes brutally so, but now people paid me for it. I was helping companies turn the tables on their own bad habits, one conversation at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The more I worked with new clients, the more I realized how rare true honesty was in the business world. Even the best-intentioned leaders struggled to create environments where people felt safe to speak up. I saw the same patterns everywhere. Employees who kept their heads down, managers who avoided hard conversations, and teams that tiptoed around the truth until it was too late to fix anything. It was like watching my old company's story play out on repeat, just with different faces and logos. But I also saw hope. At the startup, the changes we'd made were starting to stick. People who had once been afraid to challenge the status quo were now leading meetings, pitching bold ideas, and calling out problems before they became crises. The leadership team was more open, more responsive, and more willing to admit when they didn't have all the answers. It wasn't perfect, no company ever is, but it was real progress. One day, the CEO pulled me aside after a team meeting. "Jenna, I have to admit I was nervous about bringing you in. I thought you might stir up trouble. But you've made us better. You've made me better. Thank you for not letting us off the hook." His words meant more than any performance review or bonus I'd ever received. For the first time, I felt seen, not just as a fixer, but as a builder, someone who could help create something lasting, not just patch up what was broken. As my reputation grew, so did my opportunities. I was invited to speak at conferences, to write for industry publications, and to join panels on leadership and culture. I met other consultants, coaches, and changemakers who were just as passionate about honesty as I was. We shared war stories, traded advice, and sometimes just laughed about how hard it was to get people to tell the truth. But not every client was ready for real change. Some companies wanted a quick fix, a new slogan, a flashy training session, a way to look good without actually doing the work. I learned to spot the signs early. Leaders who talked about transparency but shut down tough questions. Teams who nodded in meetings but rolled their eyes as soon as the boss left the room. I turned down those gigs no matter how lucrative. I'd promised myself I'd never go back to pretending. Meanwhile, my article kept circulating. I started getting messages from people all over the world: India, Germany, Brazil, and Australia. Some were consultants like me, others were employees stuck in toxic workplaces, and a few were leaders who wanted to do better but didn't know where to start. I answered every message, sometimes with advice, sometimes just with encouragement. I realized that honesty was a universal struggle, and that my story was just one thread in a much bigger tapestry. One evening, I got a call from Greg. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Jenna, I read your article. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't handle things well. I thought I was protecting the company, but I see now that I was just protecting myself." I was stunned. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I realized I didn't need to say much. "Thank you, Greg. That means a lot. I hope you're doing well." We talked for a few more minutes, catching up on old colleagues and sharing a few laughs. When I hung up, I felt a strange sense of closure. I didn't need Greg's apology to move on, but it was nice to know that even the people who'd hurt me could change. As the months passed, my consulting business flourished. I hired an assistant, started a podcast about workplace honesty, and even began writing a book. I was busier than I'd ever been, but I loved every minute of it. I was helping people find their voices, helping companies build cultures where honesty wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. And through it all, I stayed true to myself. I was still too honest for some people, still a little too direct for others, but I learned that the right people valued that, the right companies wanted it, and the right opportunities always came when I refused to settle for less. With every new project, I I felt my confidence grow. I was no longer haunted by the fear of being too much or too honest. Instead, I leaned into it. I started each client engagement with a promise. I would always tell the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Some leaders flinched at that, but the ones who stayed were the ones who truly wanted to change. One of my most challenging clients was a well-known retail chain. Their CEO, a charismatic but stubborn man named Victor, brought me in after a string of public scandals and internal resignations. "We need a culture reset," he said. "But I don't want to lose control." I smiled, knowing that was exactly what he'd have to do. I spent weeks interviewing employees, from warehouse workers to senior executives. The stories were familiar: fear of retaliation, managers who played favorites, and ideas shot down before they could take root. I compiled my findings into a report and presented it to Victor and his leadership team. The room was tense as I spoke. I didn't sugarcoat the problems. I laid out the facts, the patterns, and the consequences of ignoring the truth. When I finished, Victor was silent for a long time. Then he said, "This is hard to hear, but it's what we needed. What do we do next?" We started with small changes: anonymous feedback channels, regular town halls, and leadership training focused on listening instead of talking. It wasn't easy. There was pushback, resistance, and even a few angry emails. But slowly, things began to shift. Employees started speaking up, managers started listening, and the company's reputation began to recover. Victor called me an evening, months into the process. "Jenna, I never thought honesty could be a competitive advantage, but you're right. We're better for it. Thank you." That call reminded me why I did this work. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about helping people find their courage, helping companies become places where people could thrive, not just survive. Meanwhile, my own life was changing too. I moved into a new apartment closer to the city and started making time for things outside of work: dinners with friends, long walks in the park, even a pottery class that made me laugh at my own clumsy hands. I realized that honesty wasn't just something I brought to my clients, it was something I owed myself. I kept in touch with the startup that had given me my first consulting gig. They were thriving, growing faster than anyone expected, and their culture was still strong. The CEO invited me back for their annual retreat, and as I watched the team celebrate their wins, I felt a deep sense of pride. I'd helped build something real, something lasting. One night, after the retreat, I sat on my balcony, looking out at the city lights. I thought about the journey, the fear, the loss, the risk of starting over. I thought about the people who had supported me, the clients who had trusted me, and the strangers who had reached out because my story gave them hope. I realized that being fired for honesty was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to find my voice, to trust my instincts, and to build a life and a career on my own terms. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And I knew, deep down, that I would never go back to a place where honesty was a liability. I'd turn the tables, not just on my old company, but on every system that tried to silence me. I was living proof that the truth really does set you free. The anniversary of my firing came and went, and I barely noticed. I was too busy living a life I never could have imagined back when I was sitting in that HR office, blindsided and angry. My days were filled with purpose: helping companies transform, mentoring young professionals, and building a community of people who believed that honesty wasn't just a value, but a strategy. I started hosting monthly roundtables for people who'd been labeled too honest in their own careers. We met in coffee shops, over Zoom, and sometimes in parks when the weather was good. The stories were always different, but the themes were the same: people punished for telling the truth, for challenging the status quo, for refusing to play along with broken systems. We laughed, we vented, and we shared advice. And every time someone would say, "I thought I was the only one." That sense of connection, of not being alone, was powerful. My podcast grew too. I interviewed leaders who had built cultures of trust, employees who had found their voices, and experts who understood the psychology of honesty at work. The audience grew with every episode, and I started getting invitations to speak at bigger conferences and to consult for companies I'd once only dreamed of working with. My book deal came through, and I poured my heart into every chapter, determined to give others the roadmap I'd never had. One day, I got an email from a woman named Priya. She was a mid-level manager at a large corporation, and she'd just been put on a performance plan after raising concerns about unethical practices. She wrote, "I read your article. It gave me the courage to speak up. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know I did the right thing. Thank you." I replied right away, offering support and resources, and we ended up talking for hours. Her story reminded me of my own, but it also reminded me how far I'd come. I wasn't just helping companies, I was helping people find their power, one honest conversation at a time. As my business grew, I made a promise to myself. I would never compromise my values for a paycheck. I turned down clients who wanted a quick fix and who weren't willing to do the real work. I focused on companies and leaders who were ready to change, who understood that honesty was the foundation of everything good: trust, innovation, and growth. Looking back, I realized that being fired for honesty was never really about me. It was about a system that was afraid of the truth, about leaders who valued comfort over courage. But I turned that moment of rejection into a launching pad. I'd built a career, a community, and a life that was bigger and more meaningful than anything I'd left behind. On the second anniversary of my firing, I stood on stage at a leadership summit, looking out at a room full of people who wanted to do better. I told my story not as a victim, but as a survivor, a builder, and a leader. I talked about the cost of honesty, but also about its rewards: the freedom, the respect, and the impact. After my talk, a young woman approached me, her eyes shining. "I'm scared to speak up at my job," she said. "But hearing you makes me think maybe I can." I smiled, remembering how scared I was, how uncertain. I told her, "You can. And if you ever need someone in your corner, you know where to find me." That night, I walked home under the city lights, feeling a sense of peace I'd never known before. I wasn't just turning the tables. I was building a new one and inviting others to join me. I was living proof that honesty isn't a weakness. It's a superpower. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: don't let anyone convince you that your truth is too much. The world needs more people who are willing to speak up, to challenge, and to lead with integrity. And when you do, you might just find that the tables turn in ways you never expected.